This is Business Live with Wilfred Frost. Our top stories this morning. Back to the office. Amazon orders its workers to clock in 5 days a week, but the government says working from home boosts productivity. Hundreds of OVO customers are to receive compensation as the energy firm is fined over failures in its complaints handling. Plus, the sick man of Europe, why tackling ill health is vital to the UK's economic growth. A very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us here in the Sky newsroom. Well, the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, has promised an end of what he calls the UK's culture of presenteeism, declaring that giving workers the right to work from home will boost productivity. The COVID pandemic saw most companies offer their staff flexible working, but is it beginning to change back? Well, Amazon said today that it wants all its staff back in the office 5 days a week from next year. And last week, PwC said it would track its workers' locations to ensure they spend more time in the office. Joining me now to discuss this from his office is Andrew Carter, Chief Executive of the Centre for Cities think tank. Very good to see you, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining us. I mean, firstly, is that intro a fair framing of things, that we're well past that COVID era of very flexible working, or is there still actually an awful lot of flexible mandates out there?
There's still a lot of flexible mandates out there, but we are definitely past where we were. Obviously, in the pandemic, we were pretty much everybody was working from home. So it was 5 days at home and 0 days in the office. Some of the work we've done recently looking at return to office patterns in places like London, but Paris and Toronto and Sydney. So an international perspective tells us that in London, roughly about 2.5 days back in the office. In Paris, it's roughly about 3.5 days in the office. So it's not quite back to what it was pre-pandemic, which is around four and a bit, but it's certainly more than it was obviously in the dark days of the when we were actually struggling through the pandemic itself.
When you see people say it boosts productivity, frankly, one way or the other, what do you think about it? I mean, how hard is the data on that topic? And presumably it depends enormously both on the individual we're talking about, but also the job that they're doing.
Yes, exactly. The evidence is not clear. There is some evidence to suggest that, being in the office or being around other people does have demonstrable effects on that individual and on people more generally. But I think there's also recognition that working from home or more flexible obviously provides benefits. The way I would think about it, and you see this in the data, when we talk to younger workers versus older workers, younger workers actually want to be back in the office more than older workers. And the reason why is because they recognize that the office is a great environment to learn from others around you, learn from your more experienced colleagues, to be more creative, to be more dynamic. I think that's what you've seen. Some of the older workers are actually saying, actually, I like being at home. I can get on with tasks that I already know. So the distinction between the creativity side of being in and around other people versus I've got this thing to do, I need a bit of peace and quiet, that's where I'm going to do it. That's quite an important distinction to make. And you can see that in the data.
One of the other things Jonathan Reynolds was talking about was the regional inequality that exists in the UK, and that working from home is one way to address that. Do you accept that particular perspective?
Sadly not, I'm afraid. So if you think about who is working from home, it typically is people working in professional services, knowledge jobs, as we often refer to them. Often, they are, higher up the income distribution. And where do they live? If they work in the city centre, wherever they're working, or the town centre, they're often living in the nicer parts of their environments. And what we've seen, you can see this through the data, say, for Rightmove, is that people that did leave our urban centres, people that left London, stayed in the Greater South East and typically went to places like Basingstoke or Guildford, because that's where they were living or that's where they were going. So the idea that we can get levelling up, if I can use that term, through a kind of bigger remote working programme that isn't really borne out by the facts.
In terms of what businesses like to hear from the government, will they see this as overbearing, or will it all be depending on the detail? And if it's just encouraging a certain step in a certain direction, will it be okay?
I think it's encouragement, rather than, a big overstep by the government. Obviously, businesses and firms up and down the country, across the globe, they're pretty much able to do what they want to do, and they'll make the decisions that suit them. And I think what they're looking for is some consistency and enough flexibility in the system that they can actually make the system work for them. And I think in some respects, the government recognises that and is not being deliberately mandatory about some of this stuff, but is giving sort of mood music type vibes.
On a different topic, Andrew, what's your view on pedestrianising certain roads in city centres? There's talks that Khan will discuss that today about Oxford Street in London. Is that something that you would welcome? And what are the bits of analysis that need to take place as to whether it is beneficial or not?
I think the context matters. Some high streets are better served to be pedestrianised. If you were going to pedestrianise any high street in the country because it's well served by basically everything else, then probably the Oxford Street is it. It's in the centre of the best served public transport city in the country. So if you were going to do any one high street, you probably would. I think the evidence is actually pedestrianisation typically in those sort of big urban centres actually drives up footfall and actually drives up spend. And people spend longer in those areas because the environment is nicer, and actually they end up spending a bit more. So we shouldn't think about it as lost footfall because people can't drive. Not many people are actually driving to the centre of London and to go on to Oxford Street.
Andrew Carter, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Time for some of the day's other business stories now. Nearly 1,400 OVO customers are to receive compensation after the energy firm was hit with a £2.37 million fine for failures in its complaints handling. The energy regulator, Ofgem, said the firm will pay more than £378,000 directly to affected customers. In response, OVO said, "We want to make sure we give our customers the best experience we can at every turn. However, we recognise that a particular group of our customers in 2023 waited longer than we'd like for a resolution, and we're overdue a response from us. So we've sent them a letter of apology and compensation to help." Microsoft's board has approved a $60 billion share buyback program and will raise its quarterly dividend by 10%. Despite being under pressure to demonstrate a return from its capital expenditure on AI, the stock is up 15% so far this year. And as we just mentioned, traffic could be banned on Oxford Street under plans from the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan. He's called for a stretch of the road to be pedestrianised to try to boost the experience of shoppers, workers and tourists. The potential traffic ban will build on current restrictions which limit vehicle access, apart from buses and taxis, to parts of Oxford Street 6 days per week. Now, energy industry leaders are gathering in central London this morning to discuss the UK's oil and gas policy. In the last hour, the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, told the Energy UK conference that the mission to deliver clean power by 2030 and break the UK's reliance on fossil fuels will be critical to the new government's success. Joining me now from the Energy UK conference in Westminster is their Chief Executive, Emma Pinchbeck. Emma, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks particularly for taking the time out during your busy conference today. What have you made of the messages you've received, not just today from the government, but since they took office a few months ago?
I think we very much welcomed energy being at the heart of the government's economic strategy. And one of the things I said in my speech today is the experience of the last 5 years tells us how important energy is for the economy. A third of the 10% rise in inflation was down to the spike in volatile international gas prices. The rise in basic commodities like the price of your tomatoes in supermarkets is partly due to the high cost of energy inputs, the cost of heating glass houses or making fertilizer. So the assessment that energy is critical to the economy, we'd agree with, and the ambition to grow homegrown, secure, clean power and reduce our dependence on fossil fuel imports is also something we would broadly agree with.
Is it a bit of a zero-sum game where either renewable companies or fossil fuel companies are going to feel the love, as it were, from government, or is the entire sector feeling like energy is front and centre for the government?
We represent a range of technologies at Energy UK. We're technology neutral, although we don't represent upstream oil and gas. We do have thermal generators and a range of other technology providers in the membership. And the energy sector is pretty clear on the direction of travel for energy, which is much more electrification, more renewables and more clean technologies. And that's because we can see a 460 billion upside benefit to the UK economy of moving to a clean power system, but also because the cost falls in things like renewables, batteries, and other clean technologies means that these are the technologies of the next industrial revolution. And we're in competition with places like the US and China and Europe to scale them up here. So we are united in what would be called delivering net zero, but also in just delivering the energy transition here in the UK. And it's not a zero-sum game, it's definitely every tool in the box.
Do some parts of the industry have fears about the pace of change? Not so much whether it's right to be ambitious to deliver clean energy as fast as possible, but whether perhaps in the short term it might be jobs net are lost if we close down older parts of the business sooner than we're ready for.
The Secretary of State today was talking about the need for a just transition, which is something that we have advocated for as Energy UK for a long time. And that's the idea that when we're closing things like coal-fired power stations or moving from old industries to new ones, we need a plan to make sure that workers can transition to new industries. Oil and gas workers have skills that we can use in the renewable sector, from marine divers to engineers. And we do need a more sophisticated plan with government for how we're going to manage that transition. But overall, we are very clear about the economic imperative of doing this and the race that we're in with other markets for these technologies, their supply chains and their factories. And we want them to be in this country. And that is the message from government and the bit of it that we welcome.
What is your view on the government's decision to get rid of the winter fuel payment for pensioners?
We weren't working on that before the election. Our work was much more focused on the need for additional targeted support for this winter. There is about £3 billion worth officially on the supplier books from people who can't pay their energy bills. We would like to see a solution for debt, but we'd also like to see targeted support. We are advocating for a doubling of the warm times discount, which is the support that goes to the most vulnerable homes. On winter fuel payment, the thing that we've said is that when you make a change to policy, you've got to make sure that people at the edges of that targeting, if your means testing, aren't left behind. There are about 750,000 pensioners who should be on pension credit, who currently are not on pension credit. We'd like to see a focus on what we do about them, a focus on anyone on the edges of losing out on their support. And we'd like to see a much bigger data sharing exercise between government and industry to help make sure we know who really needs our help, whether that's pensioners or whether that's working families who really will struggle this winter.
So are you suggesting there, Emma, correct me if I'm wrong, that this decision might have been a little bit rushed, or that the sufficient planning for the consequences of it might not have been put in place?
Our case to government in the run-up to the election was for a much broader package of measures, which included...
But we're after the election now. So what is the view?
Yeah, and it's still the same view. So we have been meeting the minister and hope to get a package of measures together soon for this autumn. And our focus has been on very much getting targeted support to the homes that really need it, on top of about £500,000 of additional support that the suppliers themselves are already offering, and the regulated support schemes. It's got to be that package of measures because we have so many people still struggling with the after effects of the energy crisis. And I'm hoping we can say more about that shortly.
Emma Pinchbeck, thanks so much for joining us. Let's have a look at how markets are trading this morning. Decent session in Europe, but before we get that, let's have a look at Asia. Hong Kong strong, up 1.4%. The Nikkei weak, it was down as much as 2%, the Japanese index, but pared its losses to end down 1%. Big problem over the last couple of days for the Nikkei has been the strengthening yen. The yen itself flat today, but catching up from yesterday because Japan had been closed yesterday, as had Shanghai. Shanghai, though, making up for that yesterday. Today is down 0.5%, closed yesterday after some soft economic data over the weekend. As I said, Europe, strong session, up pretty much the best part of 1% across the board. Spain up more than 1%, Italy exactly 1%, and Germany and France up 0.9%. The FTSE 100 also higher by a healthy 0.8% today. Kingfisher, the home improvement retailer which owns B&Q, is up a healthy 7% after they upped their profit guidance. Mentioned the stronger yen of late. Today is actually quite a calm day on currencies, but the dollar has been weak of late as we kick off a two-day Federal Reserve meeting. The US Central Bank gathers today, announces its decision tomorrow, and it's now a 67% expectation amongst traders in the market that they'll cut interest rates by 50 basis points, a full 0.5%. Of course, the Bank of England decision comes on Thursday, and expectations there of another rate cut, just of 25 basis points, are rising, though not the base case. 37% the expectation there. But as you can see, sterling against the dollar today is basically flat, but holding near that 132 level. Quick look at oil prices, which have been very weak of late, but enjoyed a bit of a bounce yesterday. Today, just trading back 0.4%, 72.44 on Brent. Well, let's discuss markets now with Freddie Colquhoun, Investment Director at JM Fin. Thanks so much for joining us. Good to see you. Why don't we just kick off on that big picture point first of all? It is the topic of the week ahead of the Federal Reserve decision tomorrow. If we get that almost double cut, 50 basis points, is that something that the market will celebrate, or does it actually reveal weakness in the economy that the market will be worried by?
Yeah, well, it's a seminal moment now for everyone watching the Federal Reserve. It'll be the first time that they cut rates in 4 years. And as you say, it's going to be whether it's going to be a 25 basis point cut or a 50 basis point cut. And as you said, the market has moved towards a 50 basis point cut. We've got the retail sales coming out today, which I think will probably determine the Federal Reserve's decision. These are August figures. And if these numbers come in weaker than expected, then that could suggest that the consumer is cracking, and that might then just tip them into the 50 basis point cut. We think they should go for 50 basis points anyway, given the recent economic data and the employment data certainly has been weaker. It would also get them ahead of the game, we think, because if the data becomes worse over the next few weeks and maybe up until the 5th of November, where the election is called, it won't necessarily mean that they have to do an intra-meeting cut, which would then push accusations onto the Federal Reserve that they're meddling with the election.
If we do start to see more interest rate cuts in the US, do you expect that the theme of late, the dollar weakening, to continue? And how does that then inform your advice to clients of how to invest? Does it make UK equities more attractive, less attractive?
Yeah, well, if rates get cut and get cut further than investors expect, we would expect the dollar to weaken. Of course, we've got the election coming up, which may also determine the path of the dollar. But as you quite rightly say, having a weaker dollar would potentially make some other geographies a little bit more attractive to invest in particular emerging markets that have struggled under a strong dollar since the end of 2021. And indeed, the sterling dollar rate at 132 today makes it look attractive to invest in UK assets as well.
Let's talk about a couple of very big US stocks that come up fairly often. Apple was down nearly 3% yesterday. Why was that?
Yeah, well, it was the much anticipated first weekend of the selling of the iPhone 16 Pro and the Pro Max versions of this very expensive unit. It's going to retail in the UK at almost £1,000 a unit. And we got the first indications out from some analysts yesterday to suggest that the pre-orders and the sales were about 12% lower than this time last year when they launched the iPhone 15. And so with that extra cost, but also coming with extra technology, I think consumers are going to need to be convinced that it is worth the upgrade into this expensive new iPhone.
And just quickly, a view on Microsoft, which I guess was flexing its muscles in terms of the strength of its balance sheet yesterday?
I mean, it's hard to keep the Magnificent Seven out of the news. I mean, yesterday they announced after market that they were going to increase their dividend by 10% and then start again another whopping share buyback. I mean, just to put it into perspective, that $60 billion is almost about the size of the annual transport budget in the UK here. So it's an enormous figure. And the shares in the pre-market today are up about that 2% on that news.
I like the kind of niche comparison there. I don't know why you went for the transport budget, but perfect size. There we go. Freddie, thanks so much for joining us. Much appreciated. Still to come here on Business Live, we'll be live at Kew Gardens, where the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, due to speak about climate change shortly. We'll be right back.
I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, covering a world that seems to be unravelling. War, unrest, revolutions.
It's not his country, it's ours, and we're going to take it back.
They have succeeded for the first time in their country's history in removing a leader from power. Now, freedom! There was fighting here, but there's clearly now a lull, and they're using it to bring up more ammunition.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. This is a mass exodus in which Russia is hemorrhaging some of its brightest and its best. According to the local weather channel, there have been more than 2,500 lightning strikes, torrential rain and flash flooding, all on top of this week's lethal tornado. What stays with you most in this job is some of the people you meet. What is your worst fear about what the Russians want to do to the children?
They're just boosting demographics by stealing young people.
Would you like to take the opportunity, Mr. President, on Sky News to invite Barack Obama to come here? Mr. Trump, are you running for president? Can you confirm it?
We're going to take a look, a very serious look.
On that day, we saw your fighters killing women, killing children. Was that a mistake? Did you go too far? You couldn't control your fighters? The full force of the state is being used to crush any protest. It's half an hour now past the deadline that Hamas issued with its ultimatum to the people of Ashkelon, and we've now seen a third barrage of rockets coming in. Another alarm. The mood here is jittery and nervous. We're seeing the world get more and more divided, and it's our job to try to make sense of it all.
Significant day.
Well, thank you.
Welcome back. We're going to go immediately live now to Kew Gardens to listen to the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, speaking about climate change.
As Foreign Secretary, I've wanted to do this for years. So I'm going to enjoy it. And this, of course, is just after you hosted the Colombian president of this year's Nature COP in Cali this morning. Conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East have dominated my time in office so far. But I was very clear in opposition that in this job, I would focus on the most profound and universal source of global disorder, the climate and nature emergency. Over my political career, it has become clearer to me how this crisis defines our time. And as a young backbencher, I admired Robin Cook making climate a geopolitical issue for the first time. He was a pioneer ahead of his time. 4 years ago, I spoke about the essential link between climate justice and racial justice in a TED Talk. And as Shadow Foreign Secretary, I set out how our response to this crisis both can create an unparalleled economic opportunity, but also is central to the geopolitical challenge of our age. Time and time again, it is the most vulnerable who bear the brunt of the crisis. From Ella Kissy Deborah, a 9-year-old Londoner killed in part by unlawful levels of air pollution near her home, to communities that are dear to my heart in the Caribbean, whose leaders tell me they feel neglected as they struggle with stronger, more frequent tropical storms caused by a crisis not of their making. So our goal is progressive, a livable planet for all now and in the future. But we need a hard-headed, realist approach towards using all levers at our disposal, from the diplomatic to the financial. And I say to you now, these are not contradictions, because nothing could be more central to the UK's national interests than delivering global progress on arresting rising temperatures. My argument to you today is that demands for action from the world's most vulnerable and the requirements for delivering security for British citizens are fundamentally aligned. And this is because the crisis is not some discrete policy area divorced from geopolitics and insecurity. The threat may not feel as urgent as a terrorist or an imperialist autocrat, but it is more fundamental. It is systemic, it's pervasive, and accelerating towards us at pace. Look around the world. Countries are scrambling to secure critical minerals, just as great powers once raced to control oil. We cannot let this become a source of conflict. In the Arctic and Antarctic, global warming is driving geopolitical competition over the resources lying beneath the ice. And in the Amazon, there have been the worst droughts ever recorded, partly as a result of deforestation. In the Caribbean, I saw on day one in this job the devastation caused by Hurricane Beryl, the earliest forming Category 5 hurricane on record. And in places like the Sahel, South Sudan, Syria, rising temperatures are making water and productive land even scarcer. These are not random events delivered from the heavens. These are failures of politics, failures of regulation, and frankly, failures of international cooperation. And these failures pour fuel onto existing conflicts and regional rivalries, driving extremism and displacing communities and increasing humanitarian need. And it would be a further failure of imagination to hope that they will stay from our shores, that we can keep them away. Let's take migration. We are already seeing that climate change is uprooting communities across the world. And by 2050, the World Bank's worst-case estimate is that climate change could drive 200 million people to leave their homes. Or we could take health. The World Health Organization says climate change is now the biggest threat to human health. We saw in the pandemic how quickly an infectious disease could spread from animals to humans, and then from a city, the other side of the world, to here in Britain. This becomes only more likely as the climate and nature crisis grows. And this crisis threatens the things we take most for granted, from the food that we eat to the air that we breathe. But despite all of this, there remains a tendency for climate and